Hello, and thank you, Maria, for inviting me to speak here today. Lovely. As the incidence of low literacy and functional illiteracy is rising to alarming proportions, at the same time, but not coincidentally, a growing number of digital media forms are offering convenient alternatives to reading. Where people would once have happily turned to print, they now jump at the opportunity to avoid having to use text and read. Take series, YouTube videos, TED Talks, podcasts, vlogs, audiobooks, and of course, the latest addition is to farm out reading and writing to AI. To communicate with ChatGPT, you don't need text at all anymore. You just talk to it. Such AI audio and video capabilities will be making reading and writing more and more dispensable. We're clearly very keen for this to happen. Text is still used for short purposes, like tweeting or to interface with our devices, but reading for its own sake is becoming a less and less popular pursuit. So, does all this mean that we have a reading crisis on our hands? Or are we simply so successful at finding digital alternatives that reading is actually losing its function? Either way, the functional story on reading that we so often rely on as reading promoters is beginning to wear a little thin. The story of how necessary reading is to survive in our literate society is becoming less convincing. What I want to argue today is that a functional perspective on reading is simply too limited, and that to get an idea of the real significance of reading, we need to radically reverse our perspective. Instead of asking ourselves, as we usually do, what important functions reading has in society, what urgent demand there is for reading, let's ask ourselves what reading does to us. Writing is a technology. The functional perspective on reading depends on the fact that text is a technology. We always invent technologies for greater convenience. Our first thought is about what functions we can outsource to it, how we can use it to do things more conveniently or more quickly. This functional perspective also comes with the idea that as its inventors, we must be in control. But we forget that all technology also always has unintended effects and sometimes even unwanted ones. Put to work for us in the motor car, the wheel has vastly increased our mobility in terms of speed, range, load carrying, and other forms of convenience. However, the large-scale adoption of this fantastic technology has also brought with it such unintended effects as road toll, pollution, and the dormitory suburb. One particular unintended effect that we frequently encounter after the introduction of new technology is the so-called use it or lose it principle. And a recent trend in mobile phone use nicely illustrates both the use it or lose it principle and the tendency that we want to avoid reading and writing if we possibly can. That trend is for young people to leave each other spoken messages instead of text messages. In this way, they can avoid reading and writing, but they also, in the process, lose the ability to answer the phone and carry on a conversation, which is why we invented the phone in the first place, of course. They apparently are overcome by a sort of panic that they may not have sufficient time to respond to the other person. And they need to sort out their thoughts before they can reply. Now, don't worry, this is not going to be a diatribe against technology. I don't propose that we go back to the state of savages, but I do want to make a special case why we should not let reading unintentionally fall victim to technological progress and its unintended consequences. Let's face it, reading is a challenge. And we have to acknowledge that even if we designed it as a technology of convenience to help us, that it's nevertheless a challenge to humans, and the urge to replace it is very understandable. Reading places a huge cognitive burden on us. As neuroscientist Dr. Ernst Puppel has called reading one of the most unnatural ways to use our brain, and he was not being flippant. Another neuroscientist, Stanislas Dehaene, has convincingly shown why reading is so unnatural. One reason is that in order to read, we have to reprogram a part of our brain that was once intended for facial recognition. This recycling of existing cortical circuits requires a formal learning process that takes years. Every human baby learns to speak. Oh, sorry, how do I go back? Okay. Every human baby learns to speak by just being surrounded by other speaking people. But as linguist Steven Pinker, there in the bottom right-hand corner, once vividly put it, unlike spoken language, the ability to learn to decipher letters and read text is what he calls an optional extra. And it is hard work for our brain to get this option installed properly. Another reason why reading is so unnatural is that evolution has wired our brains for distraction. The human brain is conditioned to remain alert to any slight movement in the savannah and to maintain focus on a seemingly endless array of unmoving characters is a tough challenge. And even after we have learned to read, it remains a matter of great mental discipline throughout our lives. Precisely because reading is so unnatural, the search for greater ease and ways to avoid having to read is so intense. So, can we do without reading and writing? Well, A, reading is very unnatural. B, we go to great lengths to avoid it. And C, we've got the means to do so. To watch and listen is much less cognitively challenging. You don't even have to be literate to do so. So given these three factors, isn't it tempting to give up the battle and choose to put our energy into making reading and writing gradually even more superfluous? Was the need for reading and writing perhaps even only a temporary blip in human history? Sure, we could put all our energy into making reading more and more superfluous. However, I believe that reading has a fundamental significance for our contemporary society that the functional perspective simply fails to do justice to. So let's instead focus for a minute on what reading does to us. And two things I think stand out. One is that reading leads to a literate way of thinking, linear, analytical, and logical. And it has also, in the process, taught us to be more objective because we've turned words into actual objects. The other thing is that where speech had already made the ability for the human species to cooperate far greater than that of any other animal, our use of written language has enhanced that ability even further. It's on these two fundamental achievements that our present-day advanced society is founded. Depending on the specific country you look at, it's a mere 6 generations ago that compulsory education was introduced. And once every newborn child was subjected to this compulsion, having to learn to read in school, it wasn't very long before near-universal literacy emerged. And this mass literacy resulted in a tremendous boost of our collective capacity for literate thinking. That has in turn had huge cultural effects over the last century and a half. First, consider the knowledge revolution, made possible by what Isaac Newton described as the ability to stand on the shoulders of others, of giants, actually, he said. And this includes huge scientific breakthroughs that you're now all familiar with and take for granted in areas as diverse as history, philosophy, linguistics, but also particle physics, genetics, nanotechnology, and so on. Next, consider the emancipation of disadvantaged social groups such as workers and women. Consider the collapse of a class-based social order, which gave way to an order based on political equality. Consider the rise of modern democracy. But above all, consider the enormously complex society we live in today, characterized by global networks of interdependence that has emerged in the short time that general literacy has been around. Without widespread literacy, none of these developments could have occurred. But conversely, to continue to live in such an advanced sort of society requires literate thinking and sophisticated ways to cooperate. With the help of reading and writing, we have unintentionally created a world of such complexity with such complex challenges that it's extremely unlikely that we could do without them. The achievements I just listed are only ever provisional in the face of a constant barrage of complex challenges. Think of environmental pollution, climate change, and the growing threat to biodiversity. Think of political polarization, populism, and other threats to democracy. Think of migration, and so on. Since we need all the literate thinking we can muster for our continued survival, and since literate thinking requires reading, clearly the answer to the question, can we do without reading, is a resounding no. Or rather, the answer is yes, it may be possible to replace so much of our reading and writing functionally, but we would pay a very high price. Reading and writing have, so to speak, given us cognitive wings. With those wings, we have flown higher than we could ever have imagined. And if we were to give up the challenge of reading, we would just crash down to earth. Paradoxically, of course, it is precisely the unnaturalness of reading and writing that stimulates that critical thinking. So the next step is to realize that the way our brains work is influenced not only by the fact that we have learned to read, or by how much we read, but by how we read. For convenience, I like to distinguish three types of reading. There's first of all skimming, which we use to find relevant information in large amounts of text. Then there's immersion, or being absorbed in stories that carry us away with them. And the third is higher level reading, or deep reading, paying close critical attention to what we read, to the meaning of the words, and to the intention behind them. There is no hierarchy between these three forms. We simply choose between them depending on the circumstances, depending on what we want to read and how we want to read it. However, as the Ljubljana Reading Manifesto suggests, and I'm one of the authors of it, it's the last of these three, higher level reading, that has contributed most to the literate way of thinking that we've just been examining. It requires a willingness and, of course, an ability not to take text at face value and to carry on a critical dialogue with the text and its author in a nuanced way, recognizing shades of grey instead of just black or white. The Ljubljana Reading Manifesto explains how reading of demanding, long and complex texts promotes cognitive patience and thinking. If we stopped training our brains by challenging them to read such long, complex text, how else would we continue to exercise and practice the kind of literate thinking that has created the advanced world we live in today? It's hard to imagine any other human activity that would similarly expand our cognitive capabilities. So we have no choice but to continue practicing deep reading, even if it may not provide the magic bullet to tackle all those challenges that I talked about. It can at least create the cognitive conditions for learning to tackle with these challenges. And I think it's our democratic duty to provide all citizens with the opportunity to develop their thinking power to its maximum capacity by engaging in forms of deep reading. To paraphrase a famous quote often attributed to George Orwell, if people cannot read well, they cannot think well, and if they cannot think well, others will do the thinking for them. This might be a desirable prospect for a totalitarian regime, but it will definitely kill democracy. Thank you.